Welcome back to Morgan Mead Makes. This is day 4 of Photoshop in 7 days. So today we're going to be looking at selections. Selections are super valuable for isolating parts of the image that you want to either draw or tweak or modify in some way. So let's take a look at all the different ways that we can do selections in Photoshop. I've got this document here with a bunch of colored dots, and I was looking at, what if I want to draw a background behind these? I had made this mistake of drawing everything on the background layer, and now I decided I want to add some sort of a gradient background to this, and there's no good way of me doing that without selections, and I'll show you what I mean. If I grab my gradient tool, and I click and I drag to create this yellow to orange gradient, it's going to cover everything in the image. So I'm going to undo that, Control Z, and I need to isolate these colored dots onto a layer so that I can draw behind it. Remember, we talked about layers being like stacks of paper or stacks of glass. So let's look at how we might be able to do that. Well, I've got some selections up here, and I've got an elliptical marquee tool, which would come in handy for selecting circles like this. However, you can see if I zoom in here, it's going to be very tricky for me to get this just right. So instead of doing it by hand, I'm going to use one of Photoshop's magic tools. It's one of the first tools that I remember seeing in Photoshop way back in the day, where I was like, oh my gosh, this is like unbelievable. So anybody who's been using Paint for a while, this might blow your mind. So we have this old school magic wand tool here. The magic wand selects contiguous colors that are connected together based on their position on the screen. So let me show you what that means. If I click on this green one, it's going to select everything green that is touching the part that I clicked on. If I had another green dot out here in the middle somewhere, it wouldn't select that because it's not touching the green that I have selected. Same thing with the red or the blue or the yellow. This purple here, if I select that, notice it did not select the little white dot on the inside there, because that's not part of the color range that I was wanting to select. I'll show you more about the magic wand tool here in a minute, but I'm going to click one more time to deselect. There's also a new object selection tool. This tool is from a recent update, so it's not been around for a very long time, but check this out. It uses some artificial intelligence behind it to look for an object within the box that you have there. So if I just let go, it's going to peer into that box and try to find the object that's in there. And it takes a second. It's not as fast as the magic wand tool or anything like that, but it can get fairly complicated objects where the magic wand tool is a little clunky when you don't have something crisp and clean like this. So I'm going to switch back to the magic wand tool, and I'm going to hold in Shift to add to my selection. See that little plus sign under my icon there? And I'm going to click each one of these, and the black and the purple and the white that's on the inside, to select everything that I had drawn. Now with those selected, I can go up to the layer menu and do duplicate layer, or I can make a new layer by cutting out the objects that I have selected on the background layer. So layer via cut is what I want to choose. And notice what it did over here in the layers panel. I now have layer 1 that is all of my little dots, and the background layer, which is nice and clean, just a white background. Now that I have the background isolated, I can go back to my gradient tool, and making sure that my background layer is selected, I can just click and drag to do that gradient again, and now it goes behind all of my objects because they're isolated on a separate layer, basically like drawn on a piece of glass floating above my background layer. So you can already see the power behind selections. There's a whole lot more. So let's add to this. I'm going to keep this background layer just for a moment. I'm going to make a new layer. And what if I want some colored squares to go under my colored circles. Well, that would be tricky to do with the paintbrush tool, but with my rectangular marquee tool, what I can do is click and drag to make different rectangles here, and I can hold in Shift again to make a new one. And I'm just going to duplicate the colors of these. I'm going to grab my paint bucket tool. So to get the colors to match exactly, I need to eyedropper those colors. The eyedropper tool is right up toward the top here. The eyedropper tool lets you sample a color and set it as your foreground color. So if I just click on this green area here, you'll see that that same exact green is now my foreground color. So I can take my paint bucket tool and just click inside of there, and it fills it with that color. So let's select these one by one now. I'm going to deselect all that. I'm going to go back to my magic wand by hitting W, and I'm going to select just that second box. I'm going to get my paint bucket tool, which is G on the keyboard. I'm going to hover over the red dot and hold in Alt. Alt will temporarily get me the eyedropper so I can sample the color. And when I let go of Alt, I'm back to the tool that I was on. This works for the paintbrush tool and the paint bucket tool and the pencil tool. Just temporarily holding Alt will give you that eyedropper. So I'm going to click, and then I'm going to go back to W, which is my magic wand, select the next one, eyedropper this by holding Alt, click in there, and do it one more time. I've got G, my paint bucket tool, Alt, click, and then click, and then I'm going to Control D to deselect. So now I've got rectangles and circles, and that was due to the selection right here, the marquee selection. So if I want a perfect square, by the way, instead of just trying to grab and look at those numbers that pop up right there, the width and height pixels, I can hold in Shift and it'll dynamically give me a perfect square. Same goes for the circle marquee or the elliptical marquee. If I hold in Shift, it'll constrain it to a perfect circle, so I don't get that egg shape. Okay, under that we have the lasso tool, and the lasso tool lets you kind of freeform a selection. Well, when would we use this? Let's take a look at another example here, which is this really quick drawing of hair that I did. All right, this is going to show you the power of the lasso tool. So if I want to colorize this, I'm going to get my brush, and I'm going to pick a color. Let's give this guy like kind of pinkish purple hair, because it looks like that would be a good color for his hair. And I'm just going to, for right now, sloppily color in here. Now I am coloring on a layer that is below the hair layer and above the background layer. Okay, so I've got my mid-tone hair. I can go back with the eraser tool and I can clean up the edges a little bit. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because it's not a hair drawing tutorial, but I'm just going to quickly clean up the edges just so it doesn't look so bad. Okay, so I've got the nice mid-tone color laid out, and I'm going to switch back to the lasso tool, which is L on the keyboard. What I'm going to do is sloppily select where I want the shadows. I'm going to hold in Shift to add to the selection. Now I'm not an expert at cell shading or even illustration, to be honest, but it's enough for me to show you the tools. Now notice I'm not worried about getting out in the white space yet because I can clean that up with my layers in just a minute. So I am going to create a new layer here, and I'm going to get my brush tool back, B on the keyboard, and I'm going to go just a slightly darker value than what I had before, and I'm going to increase my brush size, and just real loosely paint over everything that I have. Now remember, it'll only go inside of the selection. It's the beauty of it. All right, so I can hit select, deselect, or just Control D on the keyboard. And now I have something that looks like that. Now, if you remember from before, if I just Control click on the thumbnail of layer 2, that will select the outside of my hair, and I can use that to cut out all the parts where I got out of the lines. So we're using selection tools here to clean up our artwork. So I'm still on layer 3, even though I selected from layer 2, and I'm going to go to select inverse, which is Shift Control I. Now I've got everything but that hair shape in the middle selected, and I'm just going to hit delete and Control D to deselect that. So you can already see how this is helping us get like nice crisp lines, and we can always refine this later with the brush or pencil or whatever, or even lasso select and delete some areas. I'll show you that actually because I see a mistake right up in here. So I can just lasso select right in here like this, and I'm still on just the shadow layer, and I'm going to hit delete, and it just gets rid of the shadow right there. So I can just clean up my artwork like that. Okay, so that's lasso tools. We've gone through all the kind of clicky ways to select. Now let's look for something that's a little more automatic. So I found this photo online. I was looking for a picture of a woman holding a rose. This is one of the first ones that popped up. It looked like it would work. So the photo credit goes to this gentleman here on Pexels. I don't even want to pronounce his name because I don't want to butcher it. But this is a free-to-use photo that I found on Pexels.com. So you can go ahead and grab that photo too. And what I want to do now is select just the red part of the rose. My plan is to make this picture black and white with a red rose right in the middle. So I could zoom in here, if I so desired, with my lasso tool, and just carefully, go around the edges like this, and this is actually how I used to do it when I was learning Photoshop. But inevitably, you're going to spend lots of time tweaking that selection, and you're never going to get it right. Because if you look at the edge of the pixels, there's a soft edge. It bleeds into the background a little bit. So let's try that magic wand tool that we learned about. Well, if I click here, and even if I hold in Shift and add to this selection, I may or may not get something perfect, and it eventually bleeds into the face because the colors are not very contrasty. It's a little washed out looking, so it's going to be really hard to select just that by itself. So let's take a look at some of the more magic tools, like the object selection. We looked at that a minute ago. Is this going to work for us? That looked like it worked pretty good, but I do see some mistakes in here. If I zoom in, we don't get kind of perfectly next to the rose petals here, so we would still have a little bit of manual cleanup, and I'm willing to bet that the soft edges are getting lost here as well. You can see right up in here, it did not select some of the red parts of that image, but it did select some of the white. So even that isn't going to work perfectly for us. So let me zoom out here. All right, first thing that I want to do is make sure that whatever I do is non-destructive. Meaning, I don't want to go down a road making things black and white and then realize like there was one corner of a petal that I didn't get in there, so I've got to go back and, select parts and deselect, and things can get pretty messy pretty quick. So what I want to do is duplicate this layer. So I can go to Layer, Duplicate Layer, or Control J on your keyboard will also do that. And that will allow me to have a layer that I can always go back to. It just affords me a lot of options that I can work with. All right, so I'm going to go up to the Select menu at the top, and I'm going to choose Color Range. Color range lets you pick a color from the image. So I'm going to pick, and I always try to pick kind of the medium value. So not the really light part, not the really dark part, but like somewhere right in the middle of the color that you're looking for. So I would say like this is probably the brightest of the red, and over here is maybe the darkest of the red. So I'm going to try to pick somewhere right in the middle, maybe right there. And it's going to give you a black and white preview of what is being selected. Basically, anything that's white is the selection. And I can change that by going to grayscale here or quick mask, but that doesn't work so well with a red image. So let's change the fuzziness. And I want to get it to where I'm getting the whole rose, but not her face. And you can already see that I'm losing some of the rose as I lose some of her face. So I can take that was my main eyedropper to pick the base color. I can hit the plus and add to that color. So now I can pick some of the darker areas. And I'm just going to click once. I'm not going to click and drag. And click once in the lighter area. And maybe a couple more of the medium areas. And I'm going to do the same thing with the minus eyedropper and select parts of her face because I don't want her face to be selected. And that looks like it might be working pretty good. So let's change the fuzziness again and see if I can bring it down until her face disappears. And probably right there at 37 works for me. So I'm going to hit OK. And the selection does not look perfect, but let's see how it looks here. I'm going to turn that selection into a layer mask. So I've got my background copy layer up here, and I'm going to hit the layer mask button at the bottom. It's right next to our adjustment layers. It looks like a piece of paper with a hole in it. So I'm going to click on that, and what that's going to do is turn my selection into a layer mask. If I hide the background, you'll see exactly what it did. So, as we suspected, the picture was not contrasty enough to give us a good color pull out of there. So I am going to get rid of this layer mask by right-clicking on it and hitting Delete Layer Mask. And let's do something with the contrast of this image. So I don't want to do an adjustment layer because I do want to actually change the contrast of this layer itself. So I'm just going to go to Image, Adjustments, Brightness and Contrast. And I have a feeling if the image had a lot more contrast, I would be able to pull that red color out a little bit easier. Now, I'm not worried about how the image looks. I'm just worried about being able to pull out a bright red. And I might even do it one more time. So I've hit OK to apply that, and I'm going to do it one more time just to bring up the contrast even more. And what I don't want is for her face to become very contrasty and red, because that will hinder my ability to separate the rose from the face. So I'm going to do something about like that. This is just to get me that selection. So I'm going to go back up to Select Color Range. I'm going to, with my eyedropper, just pick the medium red. I'm going to plus a couple of values in there, making sure that my preview is going to give me all the red I need. And if it's bleeding into anything else, I'm going to try to minus those out, but you can see that kind of takes away the flower. So since I'm getting a layer mask out of this, I'm not going to be too concerned with selecting extra, because it's going to be really easy for me to delete that. All right, so all I'm looking at is, did I get the entire rose white in my preview? I think I did. So I'm going to hit OK. And I'm going to hit the layer mask button to turn that selection into a layer mask. I'm going to hide my background layer. Just to see this a little more clearly, what I'm going to do is give myself one more layer, put it under there, and fill it with white. Or sometimes black works better. In this case, black works better. Okay, so selecting the layer mask of my copy layer, I'm going to go to my brush tool. And remember, if I paint in black, it'll disappear, and if I paint in white, it'll reappear. And I like to have 80% hardness on the edge of my brush when I'm doing anything with layer masks. And I'm going to make a big brush and just paint as fast as I can the big areas. And then I'll zoom in and fine-tune things. Shrink the brush down a little bit. And just kind of fine-tune the edge of this layer mask. I'm not using the eraser tool. I am only using the brush on the layer mask. If I were to use the eraser tool, that would be destructive editing. I would not be able to get that back at a later time. But with a layer mask, I can always paint in white and get that image back. If I went like this and messed up, I just hit X, switch to white, paint it right back. So just clean up these edges. And then you can see in the middle here, there's a lot of data missing, so I'm going to paint in white to bring that back. I'm trying not to go all the way to the edge because I was using my color range selection to select the edges and get the edges as perfect as possible. So I don't want to mess up the edges, but I do want to just make sure that the inside is nice and solid. Now right there, you can see I probably should not have painted that in, so I'm just going to switch to black and paint it right back out. Maybe even that little line right there. And then paint it back in to narrow that in. It's a lot of back and forth with the layer masking, but it's just such a great, wonderful thing. I don't know how I would do any photoshopping without layer masks. All right, there we go. So the edges are kind of chunky and pixelated. We could always just blur the layer mask to fix the edges. So I'm gonna hit the little chain button right here so that when I apply a blur to my layer mask, it doesn't apply the blur to the image itself. So with that layer mask selected, I'm gonna go back up to our filters, go to blur, and I want the tiniest amount of blur that I possibly could. So let's do something like maybe 2 pixels. That looks like too much. I'm gonna do 1 pixel, and that looks a whole lot better. It just takes the sharpness off the edges. If I uncheck the preview, you'll see what I mean. Right up in here, you can see how bad that looks. And if I hit preview, it softens it up quite a bit. All right, let's zoom back out. And I'm going to turn off that black background, and I'm going to turn on the regular background. Now you might be thinking, that rose is way too red. Don't worry, we can change it. We have a layer mask, which means we can just turn that right back into a selection at a later time. So let's duplicate that background layer. Now I have another copy of that layer that I can use. And I can even hide the super contrasty layer. And if I just control click that layer mask, it will select everything based on the black and white values of that mask. Now I can hit create layer mask, and I've effectively transferred that layer mask up to my new layer. So these are the exact same mask. So now I don't even need this layer. I could delete it if I want, just drag it to the trash can. And now I've got I'm back to something that looks like the original image. The cool thing is I can go back to this background layer now, and I can go up to my adjustments, and I can do a black and white filter, and I can fine tune the black and whiteness of every color. So, you know, maybe my red values are like that, and my yellow values are a little brighter. Greens maybe darker. And I can fine tune this until I get the black and white image that I've always hoped and dreamed about, and hit OK. And I've got a red rose on a black and white image. It's not too hard to do. And I can, since this is a separate layer, I can always fade it up and down by changing the opacity of it. I can make it very muted, so it's very subtle. I could change the blending mode to something that might work for us a little bit better. You know, the world is your oyster because you've used layers and layer masks. You've done an entire non-destructive workflow. Okay, so there is one more thing that I would like to show you, switching back to the colored dots example. I'm going to turn off that obnoxious background, or better yet, I'm just going to change that obnoxious background to white. You can use selections to make paths, and you can make paths into selections. So I'm going to show you that real quick. I'm going to control-click on that thumbnail to select the rectangles. And I'm going to switch over here from layers to paths. And we've got a bunch of buttons at the bottom here. The one that I can click down here is called Make Path from Selection. So if I do that, it changes it into a work path, and this is something that I can change with my path selection tools right down here. I can select the whole path or part of the path, the little vertices of the path. So I can adjust these and make really interesting shapes like this. Or I can go in here and, you know, bring it in slightly like this. I can do whatever I want with these paths. Do something like that. Okay, and you might be thinking, well, what the heck is a path all about? Well, a path will help you get nice curves that you can use for either selections or drawing outlines or, you know, whatever. There's a million uses for them. I'm going to get my path selection tool, maybe just move these paths down so that we can use them down here. There we go. And if I just click on the work path, what I can do is I've got buttons down here for fill and stroke. So if I fill them, we got to select them first. I'm going to go to a new layer just so that we don't mess anything up. And if I fill them, it will fill with whatever color I have selected. So let's get a color that's not white. And let's go to fill. And if I deselect that work path, now you can see I get nice clean edges for whatever was drawn. Get my work path again. Let's switch over to black and we'll give it a stroke. Now the stroke is going to be fairly arbitrary, but it will copy whatever your brush was last if you select your brush. So I'm going to undo the stroke. I'm going to get the brush tool and put it exactly at the size that I want. Maybe I want to match the stroke that's up here. So now I've got that as my brush. I've got my work path selected, and I'm going to hit stroke with the brush tool active. And now it's going to stroke it with the active brush. So if I deselect, now I've got a cool stroke on here. So you can use paths to create characters or do some shading or whatever. I can draw a path with this pen tool. So if I click and drag, I get the handles to make it nice and curvy. And if I just click once, then I get a sharp edge. And then I can go back to my direct selection tool and just change individual vertices. Make something that looks like a raindrop flying sideways. You know, move the handles to change the tangent curve. And then when I'm done, I select it and I can fill it. And when you're done, you can select that work path and like this, make sure it's highlighted, and you can always change your path right back to a selection. So right here, if I click on load path as selection, now it turns it into a selection again that I can do whatever else with. Make a mask or, you know, whatever. So there you have it, 1,000,001 ways to make selections and use selections at your disposal. Play around with this for the next 45 minutes or so, and then come back tomorrow for Photoshop Day 5.